Plato, I'll tell you, I have a long relationship with Plato. I was born into a very religious family, and on the Sabbath, we couldn't do anything but read. And one Sabbath, I somehow, I found this book in the house, and it was called The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant. And I think my mother got it from the Book of the Month Club. It was just not the kind of book that was usually lying around our house. And I started to read it, and the first chapter was called Plato. And I, of course, understood very little of it. I was 12 years old, and I knew very little about anything. But for some reason, it blew me away. I was so excited by it. And I was a very mathematically inclined child. I loved mathematics. And this notion of sort of the eternal truths in the midst of all the confusion and the chaos. And, my most vivid experience was confusion. I was a child. I was always confused. And the notion that there was something that the mind could grasp, and that we could all grasp the same thing, and that it was truth and beauty and goodness, entangled with each other, just made me so excited that at a certain point I had to put the book down, and just because my heart was racing so much. And just the little bit I had understood. That's not the reason I went on to become a philosopher. And in fact, Plato was not terribly important for me, has not been terribly important to me through my philosophical career. I'm much more concerned with contemporary philosophy, philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, but I should say that the one place in which you hear Platonism, Platonism, Platonism in contemporary philosophy, and it's a raging issue, is philosophy of mathematics. Whether or not in mathematics we're discovering objective truths, or it's a higher form of chess, or it's just formal systems and we're making it up as we go along. Or is mathematics discovery or invention? And the view that it's discovery is Platonism, and there it comes up a great deal. But I have enjoyed Plato, and the reason I enjoy Plato so much, of course, I also moonlight as a novelist. I'm a philosopher who also writes novels, and so the idea of embedding philosophical points of view in character is central to my life as a novelist. And one of the things that I've always thought that Plato was trying to tell us by doing that, and he does make it very hard to see what the argument is by doing this, but one of the truths I thought that he was trying to dramatize was that philosophy shapes our character, and our character shapes our philosophy, and it's not just something that you do as a profession, and you spend your day in the office, and then you come out, and what you do as a philosopher has nothing to do with how you live your life. No, it will shape your life. It will shape your character. It will shape how you behave with others. And I think that that's an extremely important insight. It's something that I think that I find myself getting upset with fellow professional philosophers about. That I think that philosophy, you can't be a philosopher, a great philosopher, and then behave in a way that doesn't bleed into your life at all. This offends me deeply, and it offended Plato. For Plato, character and point of view are embedded with each other. And the other thing that I loved about Plato is he changes his mind constantly. I think that's one of the most important lessons to learn from a philosopher, or from the field of philosophy that he created, that he's always reversing himself. And so to say, what does Plato think, which I keep being asked now, what would Plato say about this and what would Plato say about that, I feel a bit of a fraud because there are many Platos. He changes his mind. It depends. Early, middle, late Plato. And he actually said that he wrote with great misgivings. And in one of his great dialogues, The Phaedrus, he talks about the dangers of writing, because philosophy is supposed to be lived, and it's lived dialogue, it's lived conversation. When you write it down, it becomes doctrine, and you have acolytes, and your mind closes off. It becomes ideology. It's the exact opposite of what you want from philosophy. And so he thought a great deal about how do you write. Right. And this was the form he came up with.
Yeah. And of course the form is ideal because you're writing characters.
Yes.
Really. And yes. You can even create your own character and shape it. And probably there's a lot of Plato in his Socrates, which yes. I think you point out.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because, Plato's so remote from us, and it's not just that he lived 2,400 years ago, but the way he writes, he keeps himself aloof from us. He's not giving us his ideas straightforwardly, just as Shakespeare does exactly. not.
Yeah, right.
And, but we do know, or we know what Socrates is like, or we know what Plato's character of Socrates is like, because of course he wrote after Socrates had already been killed by the Athenians, executed.
One of the things that you point out, you just did, and also in the book is something that I think that people don't realize as much when they think about philosophy these days, is how much it is about how you live, or in the extreme presentation in the Phaedrus, how you prepare to die.
Yes.
And I think that has been forgotten. It's, especially here in our country, I don't think that people look at philosophy this way. And I think that, for example, if you take I think one of the very unfortunate things that has happened in the relation between philosophy and neuroscience, because it's obvious that philosophers are going to be interested in the kind of stuff that we study in neuroscience, especially when we talk about cognitive neuroscience or about cognitive science in general. And one of the things that has happened is that philosophers have taken an adversarial position. A lot of philosophers, as you know, in relation to the scientists. So instead of being a cooperation, instead of being dialogic as it should be, there's an idea that I'm going to get you. You were not quite right, and you could be better. Well, it's fine. You can always improve what you do, and in certain cases, neuroscience is so bad and people are so preposterous, as, for example, your last character in the book, that probably they deserve what they get. But a lot of the times they don't, or we don't. A lot of the times it would be much nicer if there would be a great dialogue. And I think that you're someone that can have that dialogue, whereas many people in philosophy don't. And in fact, they're off on a tangent that no longer has to do with the idea of reflection, the idea of generating wisdom, which is something that, again, your book points out so well, is that the great product of philosophy at any given time is out of reflection generating wisdom that you can apply in the day-to-day. Yeah. And you actually, you close, I think it's at the end of your prologue, that you close with the idea that some of these things are so powerful, some of these ideas are so powerful, and you don't even notice where they came from because they have been embedded in the culture. And I think that the big difference is that, for example, if you go to Europe, if you take France or Germany or Portugal or Spain, you still have a recognition that the role of the philosopher is precisely that. And sometimes you get cheap philosophy and you get perhaps not the most refined intellectual work, but you do get that idea that the philosopher is part of our day, is part of our city, and should be there to help the reflection. Whereas here, the philosopher is out in a lot of fields.
So many points, yes. So many points. So the relationship between science and philosophy in general is on both sides, sometimes regrettably adversarial. Yeah. And that I often hear, I mainly hang around scientists. My background is in the sciences. I went into philosophy of science. I mainly hang around with scientists. And I'm often put on the defensive as a philosopher that philosophy is, I'm going to be vulgar again, that it's basically bullshit. And that it's, the philosophers they raise the questions. They're often proto-scientific questions. It's before the scientists get around to it, and they're very good at that. But it's basically, raising questions and speculating and, a lot of hot air until the scientists arrive on the scene, until the empirical methodology catches up with the questions, and then the scientists will take it over and it will be turned into real progress. And so you hear over and over again that science progresses and philosophy never makes any progress. I think this is absolutely wrong. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring Plato back is not because I think he knew everything. No, my Plato in this book is constantly being surprised, not just scientifically, not just by our technology, but philosophically and ethically and morally. Right. He has a lot, but no slaves? I mean, it never occurred to him, right? Yeah. So this process that he began has left him far behind. And philosophy, as you say, I think, it's very hard to see that the progress, because we see with it. It becomes part of our intuition. Yeah. And so the long and arduous, laborious argumentation that led up to this is covered over because it just seems obvious. So that
but there's a lot of work left to do. And that's I think your point is that there is a role. I entirely agree with you that it's very bad that you think, well, the scientist arrives on the scene, takes over, and the philosopher is done. That's not the case. It should be that the dialogue would continue and that the questioning will continue. And that's exactly what I think is a good and healthy marriage. Yes. And I think that, and maybe you're right, maybe that the adversarial positions are on both sides.
On the other side, science is our best, it is really our only methodology for telling us what is. It's this ingenious methodology for probing the world, getting the world so that it will tell us when we get it wrong. I mean, that's an amazing thing, right? So that we make, have these theories and can get very, very far away from experiment and from experience, but you have to be able to somehow or other get out a prediction and experiment, and it's so rigged so that if we're getting it wrong, the world will tell us that we're getting it wrong, and that's an amazing thing. So really, in terms of understanding what is the case, we have to depend on science, but there's other kind of knowledge we have. I think of philosophy as maximizing coherence and maximizing, the kinds of beliefs that we have and that we need to have in order to live coherent lives, whether they're ethical, metaphysical, like the belief in the self, and acting in your own, self-interest, and what does that mean, but pursuing your life. Even if we can't see that on the neuroscientific level, but it's extremely hard to give that up. So what it's a project of maximizing coherence, but always it has to be taken into account what science has already told us about what the world is. To do philosophy in a scientific vacuum is preposterous. Right. So to dismiss science is just preposterous. I mean, and so both sides are really erring in dismissing each other.
But you need to have an open mind in the traditional sense and be open to that dialogue and to that possibility. It always makes me think of, I learned a lot of tolerance of arguments that I don't like and of positions that I don't like, interestingly not from a philosopher, but from a wonderful writer, a wonderful human being, who was a critic, and that was V.S. Pritchett. This probably will sound terribly distant to many of you in the audience, but he was a brilliant British writer, and he wrote criticism, and we happened to know him when we were in London, and it was lovely because he would come to our place and would have drinks with us, and I really was in awe of this man who was by then quite old and had written very well and had written all of these beautiful essays about literature, and he always had a kind word to say about even pretty idiotic writers. So there was a way in which he pulled the good ideas, and he decided exactly not to be adversarial for the sake of a continuing dialogue. Yeah. And I think that way of being actually taught me something about how one can relate, even today, with people who don't agree with you and have positions that you actually want to change. There are ways of doing it without, hammering people on the head.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something that we really have to figure out. My Plato, when I bring him forward to the 21st century, and I first bring him to the Google Plus, and he's very, very excited to discover this new technology because you can Google everything, and so he gets a Chromebook and he takes it everywhere, and that of course was very useful for me because I didn't have to catch him up. He's catching himself up. He's taking MOOCs. He's doing, he's doing everything.
But it's a very good device.
It's a very good device, and he's very, very excited because he thinks that this is going to so further dialogue, that you can have dialogue with people anywhere in the world. There are blogs and there are, and Twitter and all. I actually do have my Plato tweeting. I never wanted to tweet, but I now have Plato tweeting.
Do you tweet now?
What?
Do you tweet?
Plato tweets. It's called, my handle is @Plato Book Tour, and he is tweeting, and he's quite enjoying it. But that kind of dialoguing, at first he's very, very excited, but then what he discovers, and this is when he's on cable news with a kind of Bill O'Reilly. I call it the Real McCoy show, and the guy's called Roy McCoy. And what he discovers there is that, our minds are not really opening, that this new technology is not making for dialogue between contrasting points of view. Quite the contrary. We're only talking to people who agree with us. And most dangerously for our democracy, we're all getting our news from sources that agree with us, so that, this is, so he's terrified for our democracy because of that.
So the wonderful hostess at the Googleplex, when she's asked at the end, what did he tell you? How did he answer the question? He didn't really give answers. He just messed up your thoughts.
That's right.
Which is lovely. That's exactly what you should do. You should have your thoughts messed up.
Yeah.
A couple of thoughts that are messing me up. I wanted to tell you that you had, you previewed, you anticipated something that happened to me just 2 nights ago, and maybe some of you were there. There was an event at the 92nd Street Y, and believe it or not, there was a host, and there were 3 panelists, and I was one of them, unfortunately. And in retrospect, I find that I was playing Plato.
You would play him very well.
And it was so interesting because there was, and this brings us to the last session, to your last chapter, which is Plato in a magnetic resonance lab, which has nothing whatsoever to do with ours. Although she does sneak in a task that we used in the past called the gambling task. There's something that resembles the gambling task.
Interesting. I'll explain why I did that when you,
not that I need an explanation, but otherwise it's not me, it's not Hannah, it's
good Lord, no.
We're very comfortable with that. But it's very funny because in that session, someone was telling me, one of the panelists was telling me that he was able to photograph the mind with new scanners. He was actually able, and he had just done it, he had photographed a dream of another person. And I was completely startled, and I had to say, I'm afraid not. He didn't do any such thing. And then I explained to the audience that there were really very different things we were talking about. One, the brain with all of its incredibly rich activity and with all the things that we know, plus the things that we know we are going to know, even if we don't know them now. And this other thing that we are all having right now, which is our minds, with the spectacle that we have in our ears and in our eyes of our respective beings having this conversation here and you listening. And these are two categories of phenomena that are very different, and that unfortunately people confuse all the time. And your character in the last chapter confuses this all the time. I'm not sure he's enlightened at all by the end, although he's at least startled a bit,
yes,
which is good. But that's something where philosophy can help, and
absolutely.
science can help as
Yes.
well, and to diminish this exaggerated faith that we already know everything. And just because we know that in fact the mind is obviously a product of a brain in action, although not just quite the brains. The brain inserted in the body, if the brain would not be inserted in that body, there would be no mind, which is something that people forget all the time. But just the fact that that is true and that science has the power to get there and has made enormous strides does not mean that we know exactly how mind today and how what we have in our minds right now is put together.
Yes.
And there's a lot of wonderful unknowns, and it's just silly to pretend that we know it all.
Yeah,
Because we
I
don't.
mean, and you're absolutely. I mean, this is one of the areas in which philosophy is very, very necessary. If it's true, as I think it is true, that philosophy is always has to take what science is telling us very, very seriously. Every philosopher must know science, but then see and what is implied by that science and what isn't. What do we know and what don't we know yet? And that is, what are the concepts that we have to give up that seem so intuitively obvious to us, but they are not consistent with science. So, for example, dualism, substance dualism, Cartesian, the soul. I think, this was an idea. It had its style. It had its heyday, Cartesian dualism. And, it's. I don't think you'll find a philosopher now, certainly not those who are, scientifically trained, who will take that idea seriously at this point, because of you have to take the science seriously. But there are such irresponsible things that are said on the basis of the neuroscience.
Absolutely.
There are no cells, there are no intestines, there are no, there's no agency at all, because we can't see it on that level. There's such a mistake made about the level of analysis.
Right.
And that is, this is a place where, you need philosophers knowing the science and seeing what's implied and what's still possible.
Right.
Some things are not possible anymore.
And possibly also scientists knowing the philosophy, or at least very interested in knowing the philosophy.
Yeah. So you had also said in that panel, you were telling me about it a few minutes before we came up, and that when you said this to your fellow panelists, you said, "Oh, you're a dualist,"
Exactly.
which is
right.
amazing.
Yeah.
That is so that the distinction.
Especially
made.
after I wrote Descartes' Sarah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and not that it's homework about you. Yes.
I thought it was very nice as comedy.
I wish I were there.
Would have been quite interesting.
Yeah.
So, can we talk a little bit about Spinoza?
Well, we should both talk about Spinoza, because I had to talk myself into really liking Plato. There are things that I love about Plato. I love this notion that mathematics is the truth to physical reality. It's it was Plato's idea, and it certainly is very, very important in physics and other sciences. But I had to create a Plato that I could love.
Right.
Spinoza, I think we both love.
Yeah,
Spinoza, and talk about a philosopher who believed that philosophy is supposed to tell you how to live. That's what it was all about. His magnum opus is called The Ethics, and he was an extremely dangerous man, and considered a very dangerous man, and he was born in the 17th century to an already marginalized community. It was in Amsterdam. He was Jewish, and the community consisted of Jews who were fleeing the Iberian Inquisition, from Portugal mainly. Mainly from Portugal. Spinoza's family had come from there. And he was excommunicated by that marginalized community at the age of 23. And once he was excommunicated by his own Jewish community, it fell on greater Christian Europe to condemn him. Nobody would acknowledge that they were indebted to him. Leibniz, the great philosopher who got so much from Spinoza, would never acknowledge how much he got from him, and called him bad names. And I'll never forgive Leibniz for that. I'll never write about Leibniz. But it is this such a grand view of, which I believe is a Platonic view. I think he is, in some sense, the natural, logical development of Plato. That the way
let me
that
just say that you actually made me think of Plato in Spinozian terms and vice versa, because I think that Spinoza has a lot of Plato.
A tremendous amount of Plato in him,
yes. And I only now realize that.
Yeah, this notion that ethically to save yourself, to live the fullest, maximally flourishing life, you have to get out of yourself, and you have to identify with the world at large. And that, paradoxically, the way to really be committed to yourself is to merge your identity with the identity of everything, and to love it, and that you're part of it, and to be grateful that you're part of it. So it's this grand, and that's called the intellectual love of God. But God is, of course, identified with nature. So it's kind of what you feel, and you find beautiful science or beautiful math or whatever. This just complete joy and merging of your own identity, and by the end you even care less about the fact that you're going to die. You're grateful that you had the chance at existence. After all, most don't even have that chance, right? They don't even get to exist. All the possible existent things don't exist. And this is a view that, and as Plato believed, and as you believe, that as the intellect and the passions are entwined with each other. Mm-hmm. And so as you make intellectual progress, you're emotionally changing, and your emotions are changing, that there is no intellect and passion, the two are merged with each other. And I know that is a central reason that you love Spinoza so much.
Absolutely. Just to add something that is very striking is Spinoza. You can actually write books about Spinoza, like she has done and I have done, because it's so incredibly fascinating that short life in that short man became so rich that one can go back to it.
Yes, he died at 43.
Yeah, but just think of the three names by which he was known. So he was born he was given a Portuguese name, which is Bento. Then, of course, in Amsterdam he was Baruch, and later, after he was excommunicated, he became Benedictus. What all of these means, of course, is blessed. Which is something that he was in a way, and he wasn't,
yes.
Because his life was so rough. But so it's again a little bit like Plato in the sense that you don't get to know. There were these different characters. The character growing up that was Bento and Baruch, and then later on this character there's Benedictus when he's really nowhere.
Yes.
because he no longer belongs to his people, and now the other ones are not really very interested in accepting him.
Yeah, and you know the writ of excommunication, which is you've read it.
Yep.
It's amazing. Every calumny, every curse in the book of Deuteronomy
Yep.
is thrown at this 23-year-old boy, and we don't know exactly why because he hadn't published anything yet
Yep.
at that point.
The violence of it, by the way,
The
is
violence
huge.
of it, and nobody in the community was ever allowed to talk to him again. They often used in that community, which was a very fraught and traumatized community, they often used excommunication, or cherem, as it's called in Hebrew.
Right.
Excommunication is a little more stringent,
Yeah.
but you depending on your violation, on your transgression, you did your penance and you were allowed back into the community. But Spinoza is the only one that we know where he was not allowed to do penance.
Right.
He was out, and I think part of it was because he had already demonstrated he didn't care whether they let him back or not. This was not his destiny within this community. He actually wanted out into the great bigger world, the secular world, the world of larger
But
learning.
then the story continues to be very interesting in the sense that you have this hiding under different names, which is, of course was not his doing, but there you have it, which makes him less easy to know. And then even the hiding in relation to, once he died, the body was, nobody really knows how about the funeral.
Yeah.
But he was buried, but then the body disappeared.
Yes,
There
right.
are all of these mysteries that surround.
One of the reasons I love, it's interesting, until you said it, I hadn't really thought about it, but Plato is so elusive, we don't know what he was really like, and Spinoza is so elusive, we don't know what he was really like. I clearly like elusive men, that this sort of way, you have to try to, mysterious, and you try to figure out what their inner life was like, to try to make them less remote. But one of the things about Spinoza is he did keep up a very active correspondence with the leaders of with the great intellects of his day, and after he died, he did have a very small group of followers. He would never accept a university position because that would infringe too much on his freedom, and we really have to talk about free will sometime before we stop Spinoza's notion of free will, but I want to know your notion of free will too.
But let me just say one more thing. It was so hidden, that small circle, but that small circle was very protective because, of course, he was publishing not under his name, and the ethics was the manuscript was inside a desk that was moved out of the Hague and published, but not under his name.
So, he had tried to test the waters by first publishing his theological political treatise, and again, not under his name, and they didn't even say it was published in Amsterdam. It was published in, he said it was published in Hamburg, but the calumny that followed the publication of that book convinced him that he could not publish the ethics during his life. And so those very protective friends published it a year after his death, posthumously. But also they were so protective, I was saying that all of these correspondences that he had, they went through those letters and they culled those that had too much personal information, and that's part of the reason also that we know so little about him. That they were very, very protective of his privacy. But until well into the age of enlightenment, to be accused of being a Spinozist was extremely dangerous, and meant you were an atheist,
a curse in
a
itself.
fatalist, and an immoral, because he did not believe in a transcendent God, and had a quite different, and because he's the first he's about 100 years before the Enlightenment, but he seeds the Enlightenment. But he's the first thinker since the Greeks, actually, since that long period in which religion dominated ethics. He's the first thinker who tries to ground ethics on purely secular grounds, not on religious grounds. It's the ethics through pure reason, deduced through pure reason. Religion is not necessary, in fact, quite the contrary. And that he also lived such a pure life. They were always trying to find dirt on him. So now that he was a kind of saint that everybody admired. They couldn't bear this, and Kant had to defend himself against charges of being a closet Spinozist. As late as Kant, he was considered dangerous. So, very, very important. A very, very important thinker.
And in spite of all that strong rationalism, he then could say one of the most beautiful, present one of the most beautiful thoughts in terms, by the way, this connects with your free will, is the idea that you can only triumph against, say, a problem you have that is bringing you a negative emotion by generating a stronger but positive emotion, which is something of an enormous beauty. So it's really not putting the weight on thinking through a problem in a very rationalistic way, by looking at the mechanics and the details of it only, but engendering a way in which whatever you do is going to put you in an emotion that is stronger than the bad emotion that brought you the problem in the first place, and that is going to solve the problem. That is the way to your salvation.
And then understanding in itself, if you look at it very objectively, what this problem is, and you understand yourself in relation to the world and how this problem has been generated, the very act of understanding itself, seeing clearly, is so pleasurable that positive emotion of pleasure will override the passivity. It's to turn, one of the most painful things about our life is that we're passive, that we are victims of, of all sorts of things that are out of our control. Right. We're ending with the biggest thing out of our control, we're going to die. How do we deal with that? And Spinoza, and I think this is an idea that Plato has. It comes from the rationalism of Plato as well, but Spinoza works it out in great detail. That we can't. There are so many things we can't control, but we can control our own understanding and trying to understand as objectively as possible. And the mere act of turning what's passive into activity is so pleasurable that it's a way for us to cope with the vicissitudes of being human, our human condition. And I have to say, it sounds so idealistic and so, but it works. I am a practicing Spinozist that, when the worst has happened to me, which is of course the death of people whom I love, there is a way, I go back to Spinoza, and that is a way of coping.
I think there are quite a lot of exciting things. First of all, in terms of idea, I think this materiality of the self is a very important one, and I'm convinced that it's rooted in the body. It's rooted in a fact that people in neuroscience and outside of neuroscience constantly ignore, even if it's very patently true, is that this complex of brain and body was not generated from the brain down to the body. It's the other way around. We were bodies first, evolutionarily, and we were bodies for a very long time in evolution without having any brain whatsoever. And lo and behold, there are single-cell organisms that can even behave socially in ways that are very, very similar to some of the main lines of behavior that you can find in human societies or in societies of other creatures. So there's an inversion that we need to make. We don't come from brains, and especially we don't come from the cerebral cortex. We come from bodies that are animated by life, life being the problem, and homeostasis and how we regulate that life being the critical scientific and engineering problem. And then, because the engineering is complex and because we need to manage this incredibly complex system, especially when you come to very complex organisms, then we add brains, we add nervous systems. And that continues, and those brains, by the way, don't begin in the cortex, they begin in the brain stem. They actually begin in spinal cords in our case, but the brain stem is really the main character actor. And then eventually cortices appear, and when cortices appear, lo and behold, you get things like ideas and thoughts, and you can get very complex perceptions, and you can get imagination, rationality, and moral systems, and language. All beautiful things, except that they're all there for one reason, is to serve the life purpose, which came from below and from before. And it's the fact that everything that happens upstairs is constrained by that organism that I think is the reason behind this extremely strong materiality that we feel, and here comes a critical word, is that very early on and very likely at very simple levels of the nervous system, you could get the equivalent of feelings. Of course, we tend to think of feelings as the experience of emotions, and it's all very complicated and comes out of our very rich brains. I have my doubts that a lot of very simple creatures are without feelings. In fact, I suspect they have feelings. Of course, they don't have the possibility of thinking about those feelings. They don't have the possibility of organizing a complex response based on feelings, but they have simple ways of responding. And there is an emergence of sentience at very early levels. In fact, it's quite possible that even in plants, you have equivalence of sentience, extremely low levels, nothing comparable to what you get into the animal world. But the beginnings are there, and they all come back to a body, and eventually the appearance of a nervous system. So, sorry for the long answer, but the exciting thing that I see in this field is the possibility of switching over our perspective and thinking from bodies toward, and life regulation toward nervous system. And there are very exciting things happening. For example, we're studying right now what happens, our labs have always been involved with systems level neuroscience, but we're actually studying single cells, and we're studying axons right now. And we're quite convinced that there are very interesting mysteries to be revealed in the way certain classes of axons can generate what will be a proto-feeling state, what will be at least proto-sentience. So that's it.
That's a really Spinozist formulation of the difference between negative and positive, especially thinking of the positive emotion as expansive. That is that there's something sort of constraining and separating in the negative emotion, and that as you understand this emotion and put it into greater context and connect it up with other things, that there is, and in Spinoza's terms, it's connected with everything. Everything is somewhat connected. Also, I guess a Buddhist idea that you will see that thing in relation, to everything else, and be able, and that it's extremely expansive, and therefore, and see yourself in relationship to everything else, and the maximally expansive way of seeing is the maximally joyful way of seeing, so that putting it in those terms between sort of focused or constraining, narrowing, and expansive is exactly what Spinoza believes, and I think he's right. I think he's right.
The negative and positive emotions and the respective feelings are not symmetrical. I think that in reality these are very different ways in which nature has coped with problems, or not problems, with managing life, once again. So there's a very large variety, not infinite, but there's a very large variety of negative emotions and a relatively narrower band of positive emotions. You know, it's a little bit like Anna Karenina, you know, all happy families are alike and all unhappy families are different in their own ways, or something to that effect. And it really stands to reason, because a lot of the negative emotions are part of strategies that we have used in evolution to cope with problems that we found in the environment. You know, the problem of the issue of anger, the issue of fear. These are ways of coping with threats and ensuring in some way that the soma can be maintained with integrity. Whereas the varieties of happy emotions, of positive emotions, really come out of simpler and much more focused issues. And that's the issue of hunger and thirst and desire and sex. Those happen to be relatively positive things, except when you're really very hungry or very thirsty, or when you don't have sex. So all of those things come into a different, they come into the positive side, and there's one single focus, whereas for the other you have all of these problems. And I think very often one of the problems that people face is that they have all of these negative emotions coming from different directions and attempting to solve different problems, so it's more difficult to cope with them.
Wait, so you're saying the positive emotions have this very small number?
Well,
from
in the
hunger and...
No, in terms of their individuality as a routine, for example, in terms of what they do, for example, physiologically, it seems to be narrower. Even in the states of the body that are associated with those emotions. There's a very interesting study that recently came from Finland, from Rita Hari's lab, about coding of the different parts of the body as they are involved by different emotions. And I was looking at the pictures. The negative emotions, again, have a greater variety of involvement of different parts of the body. Whereas the positive emotions, for example, happiness, love, satiation, they seem to have a more regular and narrower band. And this does not describe intensity. It simply describes what is being used.
So one of the things that I think is very central to understanding human life and our emotional life is, and actually becomes quite a central idea in the new book, but it's an idea that I've had for a very long time, is the commitment to our own life. In Spinoza's term, conatas, right? That is what we are. We are committed to our own life, committing to our life flourishing. And the great need that we feel to have a sense that we matter, that this life matters in some way or another. And so many of our emotions are generated by either a diminishing feeling that one matters, anything that makes one feel like one doesn't matter, is extremely painful. And in any way that we can affirm our own mattering, it's a source of tremendous joy to us. I mean, and of course it depends on what it is that matters to you. In an earlier book, I called it the mattering map. It's divided up into different zones. So maybe you care about intellectual progress. Not everybody does. Maybe you care about sports. Maybe you care about dressing well. And depending on what your mattering zone is, where you're situated, if you have a sense that your mattering is being affirmed, this is happiness. We write books and we feel like our knowledge is expanding. We're happy. That's not true for everybody. I very much dislike any points of view that describe this is the way to feel happy, this is the way to feel that you matter, this is the way to flourish. It really depends a tremendous amount.
Absolutely.
It's such individual differences here.
By the way, I love mattering.
What was it?
I love mattering.
Mattering is
because a great.
Yeah, I think
great term.
I think we existentialist philosophers talk a great deal of meaning, having a life of meaning, which always is too vague for me. It's mattering. Do you feel like you matter?
See, you're being very physiological. That's good, because mattering is all about homeostasis.
Well, exactly. That has that wonderful dual meaning there. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, and actually I do think that one of the things that really brought this home to me is, when I came out as a non-believer, I got a lot of emails, people saying, how do you get up in the morning? What makes you get up? And why are you pursuing your life? And I have no trouble getting up. I love doing what I do. And it brought home to me that how, for many, many people, this sort of sense of, a God to whom we matter confirms their mattering. And otherwise, they feel quite devoid of a sense of mattering. And that had never occurred to me before, because I pursue mattering in my projects and or whatever, in my relationships. But I do think, if we go to the next level and try to organize positive and negative emotions, that the notion of mattering is very, very central.
Yeah. But it's always about mattering. It's levels of mattering, because it wouldn't exist in the first place if it had not, through evolution, found to be a useful ploy to defend the integrity of life.
Yeah, but that next question, that reflective question of, and do I matter? Do I matter? When this actually emerged with great force in the same period in which Greek philosophy emerged and Greek tragedy emerged, and in fact all of the religious traditions that are still around.
Right.
Hinduism, Buddhism, the Abrahamic religion, Confucianism, Zoroastrianism, all of the religions that are still around, Jainism, they all emerged in the same period when something had happened, and I have my theories about why it happened at that point, in large reaches of the globe, that made people think about, do I matter? And that's when these great normative systems were forged. And the way the Greeks went about it was through secular philosophy. Other traditions forged religious normative systems.
Which is all the more remarkable, considering that the society there was actually not secular at all.
Drenched with religious, religious ritual, the Greek society, but their gods were so irresponsible. And they always remind me of like older siblings. They're like prettier and smarter and more powerful. But enough so that you try to emulate. I was a middle child, you can tell. Enough so that you try to emulate them, but if you get too close, they're going to turn on you and strike you dead. I think one of the things that's been interesting to me in bringing Plato into our day is to realize how similar our society is to the Athenian society that forced philosophy forward in the first place. That they were interested in these great big ideas, what is life and how do you live a life that matters? We have such a brief period. How do we make the most of it? And they went about it in a secular fashion. They were pre-monotheistic. And we are, to a great extent, thanks to Spinoza, we are post-theistic in thinking about these big questions. And so there's a way in which we're in a very, very good position to understand the conditions that first forced philosophy forward in the first place in ancient Athens. We're very close to them in many ways, good and bad.
Good and bad.
Yeah.